and off we go. All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, East Coast time, or good morning, West Coast time, or greetings if you are neither of those time zones. As you know, I'm Kata Henning, Director of Business Development with Dragon Innovation, and I'm one of the folks from Dragon and Avnet who head up the Hardware Studio Connection Program. So for our webinar today, I'm joined by my colleague, who is our guest speaker, Spencer Hartfeld. And I'll let Spencer introduce himself, but just to recap, the format will be Spencer has a few slides here. We'll go about 10 minutes, and then we will open things up to Q&A. So without further ado, off to you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Kata. How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's feeling good today, ready to go over some quality review and give you an overall idea of what you should be looking out for in terms of quality issues. Excuse me just one second. Let me get this. Just an issue here. Hold on. You're going to definitely be able to learn a lot from today to be able to not only have a better idea of where your current status is in terms of your quality control and your quality plan, but then also what are those next steps? Where do you need to go after this? What should you really be looking out for right now? What can you do right now? And what you should hold off on in order once you have a contract manufacturer that you're actually working with, or where you're actually having or where you're actually at that part where you're in discussions with contract manufacturers to be able to solve a lot of these issues. Let me swap displays one more time. I don't know why that's not
So for
working.
whatever reason, it's not working. That's annoying.
That's quite annoying, yeah. Well, we got it to work before. So why don't we do stop share, and why don't we share screen, desktop 1, and then I will go into slideshow, play from start, and then I'll swap displays. Let's try that. Alrighty, there we go. I think that's up, but still a little bit cut off there for some reason. Should be mirroring displays. Yeah, they're definitely mirroring. Alrighty, well, I think let's just get the show on the road at this point. I apologize again for all these issues that we're having with the displays, but hopefully everybody can see at least that top level slide there. I know it's not optimal to have it looking like this, but I think that we should just get going. So anyways, my name is Spencer Hartfeld, manufacturing specialist and quality and project manager at Dragon Innovation. In our agenda today, what we're going to be reviewing is initial quality insight considerations for quality planning, as well as for quality testing. And finally, we'll overview, and one last slide, the cost, timeline, and ongoing quality production and what that looks like. So in terms of quality planning, what we're going to review is what actually goes into a quality plan. So first off, what you have is standard operating procedures, or SOPs, as I have the acronym on this slide. And more or less what that is that's going to be all of the documentation that you're going to write up that will be utilized in production for the actual process flow, making sure that people are checking things properly, and that you standardize essentially how each part is inspected, tested, and reviewed before you ship it out. So these are really important and something that you should think about as early as possible as you're doing your initial in-house builds and kind of begin to gather that information learning and that information gathering of what you can implement in your SOPs later. Another part of it is the RMP, which stands for Returns Management Process. And this is usually something that you're gonna start to implement a little bit later in your process once you're already in discussions and have already decided on a contract manufacturer to work with. But essentially the process that's going to handle any returns and any issues that you're going to have with your product. And it's not something necessary to be concerned about too much at the very beginning, but if you do have returns, some beta units that you're having issues with, gather some information from those returns. Try to figure out what the issues are and keep that knowledge for later use. In addition, you've got your inspection parameters, which goes in with your standard operating procedures as well. And so what you kind of are looking for is how you're going to inspect each and every item and how you want to have the test parameters and the inspection parameters set up. And this is something that, depending on what your product is, all these inspection parameters are going to vary greatly. So you really need to look and make sure that you're designing your inspection SOP for what your product is and what your needs are. And finally, you've got certifications here as well. And certifications are essentially the overall governing laws and for each government and each market that you're going to be going into. So depending on what markets those are, you should really be cognizant for what specific product certifications you need to be in compliance with, so you don't get hit with any fines or any major issues through those either domestic or foreign governments. Second off, what should you actually be asking all these contract manufacturers as you're going through? A top one for me is traceability. And traceability is a really good way for you to be able to understand kind of how much time that they've spent in developing their quality plan and the level of oversight that you have throughout that entire process as you move from initial parts and individual components all the way through your final assembly. Scrap rates is another good generalized indicator of how many returns this contract manufacturer has seen for similar products and an overall idea of how much initial quality control goes into their products. Because higher scrap rates and higher repair and return rates usually correlate more or less to the level of quality. Not always, so there is that caveat, but it's a good indicator at least. And finally, automation, essentially what their MRP ERP system is, kind of the level of how much money and time and effort they've spent in developing their quality plan. And that's another really generalized indicator of how much they actually care and how much they want to invest in making quality a top priority for them. And when should you actually start thinking about all this quality stuff? Day one. You should start as early as possible. And that way, by figuring out what your quality parameters are, you can begin to see issues inside of your product and your design itself. And then you can actually just start designing those issues out now. Why not solve the problem now as opposed to investing $50,000 into a contract manufacturer and then have to go back and redesign something? Just solve it now. So now that we've discussed the quality planning part, let's move on to a little bit more of a specific topic, specifically quality testing. And so there's three major parts of quality testing that you're going to see. And in terms of what testing will actually be done, the first one that you're going to have is accelerated life testing. And this is not necessarily absolutely required for you to make your product, but Dragon, we heavily recommend it. And it's mostly because the accelerated life test is going to really push your product, especially electrical components, depending on what your product is. It's really going to push your product to the edge of what it is actually capable of doing, and also really pinpointing major issues and clinch points inside of your design as early as possible. And this is a combination of Haas testing as well as environmental chambers, and depending on what your application is in your product, a few other items inside of there as well. Certification testing is also a really, really important part. And certification testing is essentially pre-testing that you might do to make sure that your product is going to be in compliance for those markets I was talking about before, those markets that you will be actually going into. And then you actually have the real certification test itself. And this takes time and money. And I'll talk a little bit more about certification, timeline and testing and cost on my next slide. But what you're going to be doing is going to a notified body, SGS to Intertech. There's a whole bunch of different places that you can work with, and they're going to be running all of these individual tests to actually make sure that you can go and sell in the markets that you're intending to sell. And I see one question from Joel. Okay, so on the accelerated life testing examples.
So I'm not sure if you guys can all see the questions, but Joel's asking if Spencer can elaborate on the accelerated life testing examples.
Yeah, and so a little bit more on the accelerated life is, I'm not sure exactly what your product is, Joel, but you're going to be looking at a few different things. And basically, the primary purpose of this accelerated life testing is to push your product as far past what the recommended or what your specifications are for the product and basically get it to fail. You want to push your product to that point of failure and see what the failure mode is in order to have a better understanding of what you need to redesign, what you need to bulk up on, and be able to not have that issue either in the field or in production, so that you can just solve that problem now and be done with it. And there's a lot of different test labs that you can go to help this, to get some help with this. There's a wide array of different Haas test chambers throughout the US. I'm not sure where you're located, but there's plenty of people you can go and talk to locally. And that's something also that Dragon can help you with, to help identify and go and talk to some of these people.
If I may.
Of course, yeah.
I think I have a funny example, because when I think about Halt and Haas, I usually think of like extreme temperature or like mimicking really bumpy roads for a really long time. But I did visit one time a facility in the Bay Area, and they had designed the machine that, not to be crude, was basically like mimicked a human butt, and it was for the iPhone testing to make sure that it wasn't going to like bend in someone's back pocket if they sat on it. And so they had designed this machine, and I don't know if that's accelerated life testing.
And
actually,
and that's a little bit of it. And I think that, and that can be more durability testing as well as life testing. And so there's some overlap with those as well. And the durability and life testing, you're usually doing it kind of put after the accelerated life testing those inside and individual components. But that still is a good example of more or less what you're going to be looking at, and kind of defining in this iPhone example, how many sits or how much weight does it take to actually bend the iPhone. And having a handle on that is really helpful for you to be able to go out, increase rigidity in certain stress members and other items, and just be able to solve that problem on a design level. But I'm going to leave that for now, and then Joel, if you have some additional questions, we can pick it up in the Q&A section. And then you also have your production or ongoing tests, and this is what's going to be getting tested throughout the life cycle of your entire product. So from day one of mass production all the way to the last day of mass production, these are all the tests that your contract manufacturer or your manufacturing location is going to be testing in process during the assembly build, and then also at final as well. And you'll work very heavily with your contract manufacturer to get these test parameters fleshed out, and then define which ones are most important and what you should be investing your time in. So after this, when will the testing actually be done? So first you have your pre-certification testing that I was talking about, and you can start that more or less as early as you want. Intertech and SGS, if you have a good idea that your prototype is 95, 99% there, you can begin opening discussions with a lot of these notified body companies in order to have a better handle on what they're going to be testing your product for the market that you're going into. And depending on if your product is really new and it doesn't necessarily fit into a box that they have normally done, or into a test parameter or standard that they normally will run, they'll kind of have a better idea of where they're going to put your product in and be able to give you an idea of what testing is going to go into that. Anywhere from FCC testing to UL to CE, there's a bunch of different things. And then you also are going to have, like I was just talking about, with your durability and your life testing, which is essentially testing your product statistically to a warranty period that you define. And trying to vet out that X number of samples can be tested for 10 warranty periods, and you have more or less a good idea that your design is solid and you won't see any issues there. And so you're going to be doing this testing during the EVT and the DVT stages consistently, and that stands for engineering validation and design validation stages. And then finally, you also have your production validation testing stage, which is more for the contract manufacturer, because they're really just testing how well and how efficient the process is to build the product in mass production. But really, for your concern, you're going to be most concerned with the EVT and DVT stages of testing. And then finally, as I was talking about before, with production and ongoing testing, you have your mass production testing that you will continue to do throughout the life cycle of the product. And who is responsible for all of these tests? Depending on the resource allocation and how much money you have, it can vary greatly. So if you want to and have the ability to manage your pre-certification tests as early as possible, I'll always recommend that to get out in front a little bit and be able to solve issues earlier rather than later. But at the end, your contract manufacturer or manufacturing partner is really going to be in charge of 90% of these tests. And depending on what resources they have and what resources you have, you'll work very closely with them in order to define what kind of testing you're going to be responsible for and what testing they'll be responsible for. So now that we've gone over the testing aspect of it, let's move on to costs, timeline, and ongoing production testing. And so really, how much is all of this testing going to cost? The primary issue with the initial EVT, DVT stage testing is that you're just going to have to pay for samples. There are labor costs associated with running all of these tests that your contract manufacturer will charge you for. And depending on the cost of each individual product that you're making, this could end up being tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if you have a more simple product that doesn't really have a lot of electronics or complex parts, I mean, you could only be looking at a couple $100 for this, and it could be very straightforward. And then with certifications, going to notified bodies, this is really where the money comes into play. Because A, they will need samples, and depending, like I said, depending on the cost of each sample, it might end up being more than you expect. But each of the individual tests will cost thousands of dollars. And depending on if it's a medical device or if it's an aerospace device, it's going to be much higher. But if it's more simple, non-electronic, non-child use product, only meant for one, maybe two markets, it wouldn't exceed maybe $10,000 in terms of certification costs. But all in all, it's something that you really should be not necessarily concerned about, but cognizant of at least, so that you don't get to the point of going to certification and really be surprised by the cost of it. And in terms of implementation, how long does all of this really take? And you're going to be generating all of this documentation, and you're going to be generating all of these test plans over relatively the entire process it'll take to ramp to mass production. Your contract manufacturer will be talking with you about this consistently, and through the validation stages, there's going to be a lot of back and forth with test results, test improvements, as well as how to solve any issues in terms of testing that you do see. And the certification testing on top of this can be run in parallel with a lot of the validation testing, but it does take months. It will take time depending on how long the queue is at whatever notified body you end up choosing. It may take longer, it may take less, and depending on the department inside of these notified bodies you're working with, they may be more backed up than others, thus taking longer or less time as well. And finally, what does all this ongoing production quality inspections look like? Continuous improvement never ends. You will always be doing this for the entire life cycle of your product. You will, over time, you might begin to see certain issues that you weren't seeing before, which might be a manufacturing problem. It might be an issue with the user where they're using it in a way that was previously known about. And so that process, you're always going to be doing it. And don't think of it as a one-time thing that you only have to get out of the way at the beginning. It's a process throughout the entire life cycle. And as I was saying too, you'll also learn a lot from your returns and repairs process, your RMP learning, because you just might see different failure modes that you haven't normally seen. And then you can go back and do a redesign and solve those issues. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time today. I hope that you learned a little bit of something. And I think that on this final note, let's open it up for Q&A.
You can stop sharing. And folks, I am going to continue the recording, but if you do have a question you'd like to take off the record, just let me know and I can stop the recording so that that won't be captured.
Great.
So I see we have a question from Todd. Thank you. So Todd is asking, do all contract manufacturers utilize testing recommendations like Dragon is advocating, or is this a red flag if the CM you're working with is not asking these questions?
And it's great. And I think that it really depends on the contract manufacturer. I think in terms of what Dragon recommends, we always push for people to go and talk with contract manufacturers that are utilizing this in their day-to-day activities. And if they aren't using quality control practices, I would say that that's a red flag, because if they aren't thinking about quality, A, they're not making good money because they're going to have higher follow, and B, you're going to see more issues on your side as well because you're going to be getting more returns and failures in the field. So I think that it's definitely something that if you aren't seeing what we're recommending at a contract manufacturer, you might want to look somewhere else and get a better idea to see what a contract manufacturer that does utilize these practices look like. So maybe go out, take a look, and get a generalized idea of how those places look.
Okay. Naren is asking, what stage of your product development do you think you should reach out to manufacturers? And the same question, but for the testing bodies like Intertech or SGS.
Yeah. In terms of product development and actually reaching out to manufacturers, I think it really depends on kind of what level you're at. Most contract manufacturers are looking for a design that's 95% done at least. And I think that that's usually a good stage to begin to go out and help and talk with people. And Dragon does provide this service where we can go out and run a competitive request for quotation process for you, either domestically or abroad, where we essentially go to our internal Rolodex of contract manufacturers, and we'll identify the CMs that are going to be most apt to produce your product, and then go out, talk to maybe 10 of them. 5 of them will come back and actually want to have a discussion after that. And then maybe you'll have 3, maybe 4 that will be competitive that you can talk to. And for the testing bodies and notifications, you can start earlier than you think. I have gone to notified bodies as early as 80, 85% design completion to begin to just start that conversation. And that's the great thing about a lot of these places, is they're more than willing to talk to you, to kind of get their foot in the door with you and give you a generalized idea of what you should be looking out for. But there is a caveat, just to be careful. They will test for everything that they could possibly test for, because this is how they make money. So I think that it's good to go and talk to a contract manufacturer and a testing body to see which of those, which tests each of them recommend and each of them think that you should do, and kind of get a generalized idea of how to streamline that as much as possible.
Okay. And Spencer, just given the audience we're talking to, and these guys are going to be launching projects on Kickstarter, in terms of approaching CMs, and maybe you can add more color here, but I think often it puts you in a much stronger negotiating position to be able to get more competitive bids if you are picking your contract manufacturing partner after you've run the Kickstarter campaign,
Mm-hmm.
because then the CM knows it's a successful campaign. You've blown your campaign out of the water, you've raised X number of dollars above and beyond what your goals were, etc. But it is kind of a catch-22, because I know for Kickstarter projects, you want to ship as close or you want to set your target ship dates as soon as possible once that campaign is over. So oftentimes, if you can have external funding to be in production with your selected CM prior to launching the campaign, that makes the campaign stronger. So there's kind of the catch-22, and why we often say having external funding really plays a big role here, because it allows you more leeway and more negotiating power with the CM you're talking to. Does the same go for the testing bodies as well, or are their prices more stable?
And their prices, the notifying bodies, their prices do tend to stay a little bit more standard. And with the contract manufacturers, sometimes as well, they actually want to see your revenue streams. They want to see your forecast and your business model. So they're ensuring themselves that they're getting into business with the right people. So the notifying body is more than glad to talk to you a little bit earlier. But you do make a great point that I think that once you kind of have an idea of talking with these contract manufacturers after your Kickstarter and be able to show them, you're going to be able to get a lot more color and a little bit more of an objective view of what testing you really need to do from these contract manufacturers. So I think a little bit of a combination of the both, but waiting is definitely a good idea. So you really have a better idea of what you actually need to test for, and maybe even push back on the notified body.
Okay, if anyone has additional questions or wants to dive a little bit deeper, I see here's one from Joel.
So Joel's asking, what are some examples of things to note for the SOPs, for the standard operating procedures? I am mainly interested in examples related to machined aluminum. I think it's going to really depend on your product for the SOPs. And it's not necessarily that the machined aluminum part is really what you're going to be focusing on. In terms of actual CNC, I don't know if your product is, you said machined aluminum, so it will be CNC'd or milled or lathed. And the process for the actual machine itself, that's really going to be driven by the contract manufacturer themselves. They're going to have their own standardized way of how to run the machine, how to check and inspect the machine. But really for you, in terms of thinking for your SOPs, how do your machine parts fit together? What are the primary tolerances that you really need to be concerned about? What are the performance specs of those machine parts that you really need to be looking out for? And that's really more what you should be looking at in terms of how you assemble it. And that's more or less what your SOP is going to be. And the contract manufacturer, they're going to focus on the actual generation of each individual part. And you want to focus more on how do you do the sub-assemblies? How do you do the full assembly? What are the parameters around that? And that'll be much more useful to you. So don't worry about trying to write parameters and SOPs for individual machines themselves. Just focus on the individual parts that are meeting in your product.
Okay, so Naren is asking, can you renegotiate with contract manufacturers regarding costs and payment terms after you run a successful Kickstarter? And if so, how would you approach this?
Yeah. So Naren, I think that it depends on where you are in your discussions with them. Once you get to the point of signing off on your MSA, your manufacturing service agreement, it's pretty tough to go back. So I don't know where you are in that current stage right now, but if you're talking to CMs and you haven't signed an MSA or any type of contract with them, everything's open at this point still. You can go back and push back and try to get margins a little bit lower, trying to reduce sample cost or generalized BOM cost. And now is the time to really do it if you haven't signed that MSA yet. And in terms of how do you approach this, I wouldn't necessarily say be aggressive, but maybe just look out for yourself, right? Be aggressive, but to the point of still being polite and still considering them as a partner, because they are your partner. And and if they're not treating you like a partner, that's another red flag too.
And you want them to be a partner, because then they can go to the mat for you when everyone is happy with how that partnership is working. So understanding, CMs have to make money somewhere. So wherever their margins are, they do have to make money somewhere. They're also looking out for their own P&L. So I think Spencer's absolutely right. You should push back, but do so in a way that, is still going to make sure your product continues along the right manufacturing path.
Yeah. And then Naren also asked the question, will we be able to get a list of other notifying bodies we can reach out to? We don't have a standardized list, but really, the top 3 that you're going to be working with are either Intertech, TÜV Rheinland, and SGS. Those are really the primary 3 in the world. There aren't really a lot of other ones besides that. Sometimes a contract manufacturer can get certified through one of these notified bodies to certify your product in-house. That's more rare though, and you're usually looking at things that are outside of the scope of this discussion, really high volumes, really expensive individual per component cost, aerospace industry, medical industry, and that's really the only time that it makes sense. But in terms of the top 3 that you should look for, Intertech to SGS.
Can I ask a clarifying question there? And maybe this is diving in too deep. When you are sending units to the certifying entities and they have to be, off tool, for example, sometimes?
To a certain point. And you can discuss that with the notifying body. They don't necessarily have to be off tool as long as they're 99% representative of production samples.
Okay. Who logistically is responsible for, picking those units, certifying that validating that they were made on the tools if they had to be, and shipping them to the body? Or do they come to your CM to pick them up?
Well, it's and you will ship the products to the notifying body to have them test in-house, but they will also do a factory inspection to make sure that they still meet ISO standards and generalized manufacturing processes. So they will do a generalized factory audit that they will continually do either once a year or once a quarter, depending on the product and where the factory is. But in terms of who's sending all this stuff, it can be either. So if you really have an issue and you really want to have better quality control over a certain aspect of a part or a component, you can opt to send the samples yourself if you want to. And if you can 3D print, or you can use other types of rapid prototyping and manufacturing that will get it to 99% representative, you can do that. Or if you have a lot of trust in your contract manufacturer, which I really hope you do, because that's really important, then you can just rely on them to have them do a little bit of pre-test validation for you, and then just send them right to the notified body.
Okay. Next question. So Naren is asking a follow-up. So do you believe it's a good approach to get RFQs, then run the Kickstarter, and then sign the MSA?
You could do it that way. I think it's usually, I think consistently in our experience, and Kata, feel free to jump in on this as well, but I think in our experience, we find that contract manufacturers are much more responsive if they see that you already have had a successful Kickstarter. And it doesn't necessarily hurt to go out and begin an RFQ, but I think that you're going to get better CM candidates and you're going to get a much better response once they see, oh, they're valid. They have the Kickstarter, they have some money coming in. And that gives them a little bit more ease to go out and spend that week of intensive work to go through your BOM and quote it out, and maybe even give you a better price, or at least a more competitive quote.
Yep. This is going to be a bit of personal opinion here, but I think to answer your question, I would say it depends. But in an ideal world, in terms of strength of the Kickstarter campaign, using it kind of as that launch vehicle or the marketing vehicle where you then can ship the product, within a month or 2 months, that recency, even if it's a month, in terms of I back your project on Kickstarter and then get my product, you are just creating social capital, or what's the word I'm looking for? Like trust with the backers that just can't necessarily be the same if they don't get their product, 10 months after they back a campaign, because the market will change. So therefore, what I would say in an ideal world is you would approach Kickstarter probably with some external funding or alternative funding sources, because that would put you, as long as you have money in the bank and you can show that to the CMs, then it puts you in a stronger negotiating position for the RFQ, and then running the Kickstarter. So Naren, it totally depends, and we can talk about this offline too, in terms of the particulars for your product. And things are also different, if this is a company who is not running their first Kickstarter campaign, but it's their second or third,
right.
And then maybe they have an existing relationship with the CM, which can mitigate some of the other risks.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions for Spencer. And if not, I'll throw one out there that I'm not curious about. I know you've touched on this a little bit, but when you were talking about quality planning and quality testing, it sounds like there's always a give and take between what myself as the entrepreneur would be responsible for and what I would kind of, through the MSA, the manufacturing services agreement, make the responsibility of my CM, my contract manufacturing partner. But before I've picked my CM, what can I really do? What are the things for the planning phase, the documentation, like what goes into that will set me up to be in a good position later on?
Yeah, thank you. And so in terms of that, Kata, there's a few different items. So first off, look at your failures. What have you seen that consistently fails inside of your product and inside of your prototypes, and begin to get a better handle on what that failure mode is.
And so an example would be?
A motor burning out. Like maybe if you continuously have a motor burning out and it's in the application is within the specifications of the motor, but maybe there's some external issue. Maybe there's not enough airflow throughout the motor to be able to cool down, and maybe there's not other items that you might be able to go through and be able to solve any of those issues. So I think that getting a good handle on what those failures are is important, because then you hand that information off to your contract manufacturer and say, hey, look out for this. Like, I solved this issue by doing X, Y, or Z, but if you're seeing these failures, really be sure to watch out for this in the manufacturing process. And that'll be very helpful for not only you, but also the contract manufacturer running down a rabbit hole trying to solve an issue that's already been solved. So that's one thing to look out for in terms of this quality planning. Another one is begin to get some metrics around your build time. So begin to document the process of how you build, what issues you've seen throughout your build, and also how long it takes. Begin to take videos of it. Begin to take pictures and be able to document that. So that onboarding time for the contract manufacturer is just that much reduced. Because if you've gone and done a lot of this work, which you're already doing, why not just document it and then just be able to have something that you can show to your contract manufacturer?
And so you're saying we should do that from day one, even if it's, I'm hand sewing neoprene around my electronics and there's wires sticking out. Still document all of that from day one, because you never know what will come back around.
Exactly. And I think that you don't have to be overly in-depth. You don't have to have the standard operating procedure completely vetted, right? You only have to just be concerned about writing down those little notes, taking some pictures of issues that you've seen, and just kind of begin to get a generalized idea. But thinking about it early is always preferable.
And Todd has another question. So you talk about quality testing and quality in general. When should you start looking down the road at newer versions of your product after the first one has gone to market? We could probably have a whole other webinar on this topic.
We absolutely could.
And we will.
Yes.
But it's a great question. Do you have a highline for us?
Yeah, I think high level, if you're having a lot of issues with your product and its current form, and if you're getting a lot of returns and repairs for any reason, I think that's always a great point to kind of begin to think about version 2 of your product. And that's one really big top level, but it also depends on your market. It depends on if the market is changing more quickly and people are outgrowing your product and you need to add some features to go into that. But in terms of just quality itself, I think you should only really be overly concerned when you're really beginning to see issues. And outside of that alone, it kind of falls outside of the scope of quality itself. It begins to go into market research and other design improvements and kind of what you want to be for the next product. But when you develop that, take the learnings from V1, implement them into V2, and then document all of that so you can get ahead of the ball and hit the ground running.
And I think Joel has another question. Joel is asking, what are your thoughts on the accuracy of pricing for the product if there hasn't been an RFQ before the Kickstarter?
And Joel, I think and I am assuming that you mean in terms of the actual MSRP of the product, not the landed cost that you're going to see at your contract manufacturer level. Thank you. And so I think it's always difficult to get a really firm number around what you've seen. And Dragon, we can definitely help with some generalized numbers on that. We can go out and we have ways of being able to determine for plastic parts or for machine parts, some generalized ballpark numbers for you that can definitely help, as well as components and PCBAs. So I think that it is tough to be able to hammer down a number as before you go to when you're at the Kickstarter level, but see what you've learned yourself. What are the purchase parts that you're going to continue to purchase? So take a look at that and identify those, because those costs more or less won't change. Maybe a little bit once you get into volume, and maybe your contract manufacturer will have a better supplier that can still provide the same performance specs, but at a cheaper cost. And in terms of your PCBAs, I think more or less looking at the spot market is going to get you in the right ballpark. Obviously, once you get into volume, you'll definitely see reductions in that as well. And I think that that's all very helpful to learn from that. But at the end, you're going to have to make a guesstimate on how much your product is going to cost. And that can be probably anywhere between 2 and 5 times what you're currently paying to actually just build a single unit. And that's kind of a generalized ballpark for what your MSRP should be.
And Joel, I would say, I know we have Bob and Chris on the call today from Avnet. So in terms of the electronic piece of the bill of materials, I think before you launch your Kickstarter, if you know your volumes, and this is another chicken or egg situation, but through Avnet and through other component providers, you should be able to have a really good sense of what the electronic costs will be. When Spencer was mentioning Dragon's tools for estimating plastic costs, I'll do my little sales pitch. You guys all have or had at least a month of free product planner access. That is the tool where those estimators are built in. So I would say in terms of understanding your COGS, starting with the bill of materials, and this is what we go through with the readiness assessment before you guys launch campaigns, but we're really combing through those numbers you share with us to make sure that they are grounded in realism, but also that, at least in our expert opinion, that's Dragon and Avnet, that your entire bill of materials is within kind of a couple percentage points of what we believe is reality as well. So happy to chat more about that offline, I think, but definitely, use the resources that you have here for electronics and plastic parts, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think just one thing to add on that as well, when you go to the RFQ, all of the quotes that you'll get back, if you end up deciding to engage with Dragon to go out and do that RFQ process for you, when you receive, let's say, the top 3 quotations that are going to be the most competitive and more or less have around the same numbers, don't get too set on that being the final number. It's a really good generalized idea, but there's going to be things and misunderstandings about how a part is formed, what the specifications or performance requirements are for a part. And I think you're never going to be able to get around that because there's just there's just too much information to just offload onto the new contract manufacturer. So you will usually see a little bit of an increase or a little bit of a decrease in those numbers, kind of depending on what your contract manufacturer ends up finding out in that information and data transfer process.
And would you say ballpark that's usually like 12 to 15% plus or minus, or like 2 to 3?
I think like the 10 to 15% range. I mean, we always hope that it's better than that, but at worst, it could be in that 10 to 15% range, which depending on how much your product costs, it might have a significant impact. But I think that it's always just really getting an idea and trusting and going out and meeting those vendors to and have a better idea and have those face-to-face discussions so your RFQ is as accurate as possible.
Okay, friends, if anyone has additional questions, speak now, type now. And if not, okay, I would really like to thank you all for joining us today. Big virtual hand clap for Spencer. Thanks so much. And I will say, if you have follow-up questions specifically about quality, you can direct us to me, and I'll make sure we flag them to the appropriate people on our respective teams. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon. Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.